thank you to all of you who are joining us this evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett, the Executive Director of the Environmental Voter Project. We have a great webinar on tap for you this evening. And as Peter said, we will have a Q&A session at the end. You're welcome to put any questions that you have in that Q&A folder on the bottom of your screen, and Peter and Shannon will try to answer your questions, but if they don't get to it, it might be because they are holding it for the end. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. We want to respect everybody's time here this evening. All right, I am sharing my screen here, and hopefully you all can see that. If you are joining us, this is what you're going to be hearing about this evening. You're going to be hearing about our most recent polling data. We're really excited to present it to you. But before we get to it, we do know that some people here aren't familiar with the Environmental Voter Project's work. So I'm going to start with a super quick, and I mean super quick, reminder of what EVP's work is. Then we're going to dive into this polling data. Then we're going to go over some of the findings and suggested further research. And then, as we mentioned before, get to some of your questions that weren't answered in the Q&A folder. So without further ado, let's jump on in. In a nutshell, what we do with the Environmental Voter Project is mobilize climate-first voters. So we aren't a research organization. We're going to be talking about some of our polling research tonight because we thought it was so exciting and actionable. But what we spend the overwhelming amount of our time doing is finding people who care deeply about climate and the environment who don't vote, and then turning them into better voters. That's it. We are a year-round voter identification and mobilization group. And what that also means is we don't do a lot of the stuff that many other environmental nonprofits do focus their time on. So for instance, we don't lobby for particular policies. We don't endorse specific candidates. We don't even try to convince people to care more about climate or the environment. A good way to think about us is that we're solely in the behavior change space. We are trying to identify people who no longer need their minds changed. They already care deeply about climate and the environment. They're just not voting. They're just not taking this one very impactful action. And so we can swoop in and run pure mobilization campaigns. And the reason we focus on this is because there are millions, truly millions, of dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists out there who don't vote. Very briefly, what we do is a four-step process. First, we work with data scientists to build predictive models to individually identify these climate-first registered voters who aren't casting ballots. Because today isn't necessarily about EVP's work, I'm going to leave it there. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on how we identify these voters. But if you're interested in more information, we do have some mini briefings on our YouTube page. We can share a link in the chat, and you can find more information on our website. But this first step is we find these non-voting environmentalists. Then we can move to step two, mobilization. Because once we find these people who already care about climate and the environment, yet they aren't voting, well then, we can be completely agnostic with our messaging, right? We don't even really need to talk about climate or the environment. All we need to focus on now is getting these people who already care about that issue to start voting. And so we work with over 7,000 volunteers to canvass, call, and send postcards to these voters. We as a staff run our own digital ad and direct mail campaigns, and we run hundreds of randomized control trials each year, figuring out which messages work best to turn these non-voting environmentalists into new voters and eventually consistent voters. Step three, habit reinforcement. We live behavioral science each day. I don't expect many of you to. But even if you're not a behavioral scientist, you could probably guess that it's hard to change someone's voting habits if you only talk to them once every 2 years when there's a big federal election going on. That's not how you reinforce good habits. Instead, you need to take as many bites at the apple as possible. And so that's what we do. We work year round in odd years and in even years. In 2025, we've already been active in 416 different elections. I'm serious. Because every election is a really unique and precious opportunity to get someone to vote for the first time. Once you do that, it's so much easier to turn them into a consistent voter. And then ultimately, step 4 is to change the electorate. Because we know that nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. Politicians go where the voters are. And right now, one of the biggest problems we have in the environmental movement is that there just aren't enough climate voters out there. And so what we're trying to do at EVP is flood the zone with climate first voters so that politicians will respond, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because they want to win elections. That's what we do at EVP. And very briefly, this year, I can tell you that we're active in these 21 states. We're targeting 7 million, I kid you not, 7 million already registered climate first Americans who are unlikely to vote in this year's elections. And we literally know them by name and street address. We're going to be delivering this behavioral science informed messaging to them. And in the past, we've been getting extraordinary results. We submit all of our work to what's called randomized control trials. We won't get into the details today because that's not what this webinar is about. But very briefly, what that enables us to do is we set aside a control group. We set aside a small portion of these non-voting environmentalists and never talk to them. Then we only communicate with the remaining 80 to 85%, so that after the election, when voter files are updated, we can compare how much turnout was in our treatment group, the people we spoke with, to those non-voting environmentalists in our control group. And as long as that initial separation was truly random, we can discover whether we were solely responsible for increasing turnout in particular elections. And just in the last 4 years, we have had what's called statistically significant results. That means results that we're so certain of being the sole driver of that we know they weren't due to random occurrence in dozens of elections. In 2021, and 22, and 23, and 24. We were solely responsible for increasing turnout among our targets by as much as 1.8 percentage points in presidential general elections, as much as 3.8 percentage points in other statewide elections, and as much as 5.7 percentage points in local elections. And those are enormous numbers in this business. And ultimately, as I mentioned before, our goal is to change the electorate. And what we have seen is since we launched our very small one-town proof of concept in Boston back in 2015, we have now communicated with almost 12.8 million unique individual voters, all of whom care deeply about climate and the environment, but were awful voters or else we wouldn't have been talking to them, right? And we've been tracking them. We tagged them in the voter file and we're tracking their public voting histories. And as of about 4 months ago, we could see that almost 2.2 million of them had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become super voters. This is the power of our work. If you want to learn more about getting involved in our work, please go to environmentalvoter.org. If you go to the About page that you'll see there, you'll learn more about these processes that I just breezed through. But I'm breezing through them for good reason. You are here to learn about some of the research that we do to support this work. And so I'm going to get into that. We chose a very unique survey design for this research. And we don't do that much polling at the Environmental Voter Project. We focus much more on individual voter targeting than broader public opinion surveys. But because of what I just told you, Because whenever we present to people and train volunteers and talk to donors, one of the first questions they ask us is, well, why are so many environmentalists not voting? Why do you have so many targets? Well, we think about that question a lot. And the truth is, it's really hard to know why people do things. And it's even harder to know why they don't do things like vote. Polls can only get you so far because when you ask people why they aren't doing this thing that deep down they know is really important, you start getting all of these biased responses. And so we thought really long and hard about whether there was a way to craft a survey that wouldn't eliminate all biases. Of course, we couldn't do that, but might eliminate a lot of them and get a clearer understanding of how human beings really think about climate change and how that might be impacting their political behavior. The way we chose to design this survey was to try to address this question, to try to figure out, can we understand how Americans are viewing, say, climate change or gun violence? Because we asked about some other questions too, to get some comparisons in this natural setting before, and this is important, before they're primed to think of it as a political issue or a social issue, as a personal issue. Because if you think about this, like when you talk to someone on the street about climate change, it isn't always in a political context. Or when you read an article online, dear God, it's not always in a political context, right? Sometimes it's, like what donuts can you eat to save the planet? It's all about like personal behavior and things like that. And so we wanted to figure out, okay, how do people often think about these issues before being primed on what context they ought to be thinking of them within? The way we approached this was with a big national survey last month. We surveyed well over 3,200 adults, and we worked with Beacon Research, a very highly rated national polling firm. And we designed the survey in two specifically unique ways. The first is we used what's called split samples. So we didn't want people to know, hey, we're going to ask you questions about climate change and immigration and gun violence and education, because once they start getting all these questions about lots of different issues, well, they're going to know, oh, okay, well, this is a political poll, and I need to start comparing my feelings about these different issues. And no, that's already inputting some bias that we were trying to get rid of. And so what we did was we asked a group of roughly 650 people about only one issue. And so these people only got questions about climate change. Other people only got questions about gun violence. And by doing that, they didn't realize, and you'll see in some of the questions that we asked, they didn't realize that they should be thinking about this in a political way or an apolitical way or a personal behavioral way or a collective action way. The second unique design that we used was we asked a whole bunch of open-ended questions. Now, this isn't totally unique. There are polls that ask open-ended questions. And by open-ended, we mean, what comes to mind when you think of solutions to address gun violence? So we don't offer multiple choices for you to choose from. Because obviously, when you give people answers to choose from, you are really priming them to choose between a number of responses. You're literally giving them the responses, saying, choose between these, or choose like none of the above. It's a lot better if you can provide open-ended questions where they can then fill in the blank. But it's expensive, because then you need to spend a whole lot of time coding those responses and then categorizing them in ways that make sense. So there's a good reason why most people don't do open-ended questions with their surveys, but we thought it was crucially important to do that here. So as we go through this polling data, bear in mind that there are these two really unique aspects about this particular survey. There are downsides to that, right? It means we're not asking 3,300 people about all of these things. We're asking groups of 600 to 700 people about a particular issue. But because of that unique way we're doing it, we thought that we could get some really interesting insight into how people naturally approach these issues before they're primed to think of them as individual or social or political or within other contexts. All right, let's jump in. First, we wanted to know, how often do people think about the particular issues that we presented them with? And right off the bat, we got some interesting data. So for all of these slides, you'll see we put the actual wording of the question here. How many times each week do you find yourself thinking about the importance of blank or issue split? Now remember, if you're in the climate change group of people, you get asked the importance of addressing climate change. If you're in the education group, you get asked importance of improving the quality of education. One thing that jumped out at us here right away is, look at how often people think about addressing climate change. Now, obviously, like, we're an environmental nonprofit. Many of you are here because you care about climate and the environment. But I think we're all aware of how low climate's political salience is. Or another way of putting that is, in political polls, climate is always near the bottom of pretty much anything that you ask. And so the fact that in this not just apolitical context, but hopefully largely unbiased, trying to be natural context, it surprised us that climate change came in only after improving the quality of education as the issue that people think about the most often. It's really, really interesting, especially compared to really politically salient issues like immigration and abortion, things that we just know are more politically important in election season. So isn't that interesting? This is the first really interesting disconnect that we saw. Next question we asked was slightly different. This is going to be pretty nerdy, but these slight differences are important. We wanted to know, okay, you just told us how often you think about your issue. Does it feel like you think about that issue more or less than other Americans? This is important, or it should be important, to activists, because what we're alluding to here is a sociological concept called pluralistic ignorance. Pluralistic ignorance is a concept where individuals erroneously believe that our private views are different from the majority view or the plurality view. So an example of this is, let's say a whole bunch of people say, oh yeah, I think about climate change all the time, but I don't think anybody else does. I think about climate change much more often than other folks. Well, maybe they're right. Maybe there is no pluralistic ignorance there, or maybe they're wrong. Maybe they're mistaken in thinking that they're alone in thinking about climate change so much. And that's important. That is actionable for activists, and I know there are hundreds of activists on the line right now, because when you think you're alone in feeling some way, or when you think you're alone in worrying about something, boy, does it keep you from taking action. Pluralistic ignorance is a really important thing to be able to uncover. Now, we saw some data here. Obviously, there are large numbers of people who think that they think about climate change more often than other Americans. When we looked a little bit deeper at the raw data and some of the crosstabs, it wasn't clear that there was pluralistic ignorance at play here. But there's certainly a suggestion that it could be happening, and that people who care about climate could be ignorant of the fact that they're not alone. And Yale program on climate change communications has done a lot of really good research on this. They have previous polling data that does show that there is a tremendous amount of pluralistic ignorance around climate change, which again is this concept that lots of people care about climate, but they think they're alone. They underestimate how many other people feel like them. We didn't quite see that. We didn't see the opposite of it, but we saw some hints that it might exist. All right. Then we dove into just plain old issue importance. How important are these issues to you? And again, I want you to remember, we're measuring split samples on purpose. We did not want to have people comparing climate to immigration to blah, 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 because that's not how we think about various problems on a daily basis. That's not even necessarily how we think about things in the midst of a political campaign. We don't say, oh, I'm really worried about the climate crisis, but I'm worried more about my kids' education, so I'm just going to forget about climate, right? It was really important. We wanted to get this sort of natural read. Improving the quality of education was absolutely number one. This was the issue that people saw as being most important to them. Overall, if you add up somewhat important, very important, and extremely important, I'm going to look at my notes here, 87% said that about improving the quality of education. 75% said it about addressing climate change, though, which was significantly more than 69% who thought immigration was important, and 62 about either improving access to abortion or restricting access to abortion. Again, I'm not saying this means Americans care more about X than they do Y. What I am saying, though, is, isn't it interesting how this is different from what we typically see in political polls? This is not what we see in political polls. We do not see more people saying, oh, yeah, in the presidential election, climate change is much more important to me than immigration is. That is not what we see in political polls. And this divergence, I think, is really, really interesting. And it's something that can only get called out in polls like this. All right, now we get into some of the really, really interesting data, because this is when we start going over some of the data from our open-ended questions, where we didn't give people things to choose from. We didn't say, do you think about it a lot or a little, or every day or every week, or things like that. So first, let's talk about climate change. We asked people, what are some specific ways you can think of to go about addressing climate change? Now remember, they could put down whatever they wanted. And then it was up to the pollsters that we worked with at Beacon Research to try to put them in different buckets and categorize them. And then we looked at those categories and we tried to determine, and this isn't necessarily, there's some subjectivity in this, but we think we did a very good job. We tried to put them in various buckets of either political solutions to climate change, things that involve laws and regulations and political action, things that involve individual action, so apolitical behavior. So you and your friends are doing something, or you're doing something in your house, or a mixture of both. So a little bit of politics and a little bit of individual behavior change. You'll see the red stuff is individual behavior, the blue stuff is political, and the purple stuff is in between, is a mixture. I feel like this is a screwed up version of Family Feud here. The number one survey response that people gave on specific ways they can think of to go about addressing climate change was reduce, reuse, recycle. I'm not poo-pooing recycling, but guys, we're not going to recycle our way out of the climate crisis. 22% of respondents. Now, I want to be clear, people could give up to 3 responses, so this is going to add up to more than 100%. 22% of people off the top of their head was like, oh yeah, recycling, that's how we're going to do this, or reusing stuff. Number 2, change your lifestyle. Educate people on the importance of addressing climate change. Again, something that has absolutely nothing to do with politics. Number 3, started to get a little politics mixed in. It was tied. 1, change consumer behavior or buy green products. Again, totally individual. And then reduce your use of fossil fuels expand your use of renewables. When we looked at these responses, it was a mixture of society writ large reducing fossil fuels, which is political, and people talking about in their own personal lives, reduce your use of fossil fuels, expand your use of renewables. So we put it in purple. Then more individual behavior change. Use public transit, drive less. Then finally, we get some political stuff. Only 8% of people saying, oh, change policy, reduce pollution. Then some more mixed stuff, conservation. Finally, can barely see it down there because it's only 2% of people, direct action and protest. Now, this is a word cloud. It's supposed to be messy. But boy, is there a lot of red there. And to present this data in a different way, if we look at it as a bar graph, look at that. Almost 70% of the responses were individual behaviors that people came up with. This is the type of information that you only get when you ask these open-ended questions. But just top of mind responses when people are asked, what are some specific ways you can think of to go about addressing climate change? Overwhelming number of responses were changes to their individual lives. Now, let's compare that to gun violence. What are some specific ways you can think of to go about reducing gun violence? Boom! Stricter laws. I feel like I want to applaud for that. But 46% of the responses were stricter laws. Totally political. Number 2, enforce existing laws, a totally political response. Number 3, require gun safety and safe storage, a totally political, law-based or regulation-based response. Again, number 4, all politics. Number 5, maybe a mix, address the root causes of violence in community programs. That's kind of a mix between apolitical and political stuff. Whoop, then back to politics, ban assault weapons, ban high-capacity magazines. Oh, support the Second Amendment, reduce gun laws, still all politics. Finally, way, way, way down the list at 4% of the responses was some individual behavior. Then enhance school safety and security. So all political responses. And to look at that in bar graph version, look at that. And so compare these two. When we asked people open-ended questions, what are some ways you can think about to address climate change? And then we asked another group of people, what are some ways you can think about to address gun violence? Look at the difference. Climate change, it was almost all individual behavior change. Gun violence, it was almost all politics. We think this is crucially important for those of us in the climate movement to understand. Climate change has not been politicized, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, in the way that many other issues have been. And we might be making a lot of mistakes in assuming that people always think about climate change in a political context like they do many of these other issues. Now, I'm not going to do word clouds for every single one of the issues we tested, but I do just want to show you some of the other bar graphs. So remember, this was climate change. This was gun violence. Now, let's go to abortion access. What are some specific ways you can think of to go about restricting abortion access? Again, overwhelmingly political solutions that came up. And a really interesting thing is people even specifically called out voting. Specifically called out voting. Yes, I'm going to bring that up. We are called the Environmental Voter Project. How about immigration? Again, overwhelmingly political solutions that came up. And again, people specifically called out voting. Improving the quality of education. We had slightly more of these mixed things because there are a lot of things that are sort of community-based, yet they require changes to curricula in public schools. And so it does involve some politics and contract negotiations, things like that, but still overwhelmingly political. And so just to drive this point home, Look at these 5 bar charts. In climate change, for climate change, the top of mind responses to these open-ended questions were overwhelmingly in the red. These were individual actions that people could come up with to address the climate crisis. But for all of the other issues that we tested, gun violence, abortion access, quality of education, immigration reform, and believe me, we didn't even want to bother asking about some other typically sort of political issues because we thought, like, of course they're going to say politics, right? You ask people about like tax policy, they're not going to say, the military or foreign policy, like those are inherently have to do with politics and government. But this is just such a stark difference. All right, moving on to the final few questions on the poll, we did then ask a few more multiple choice questions that we thought were important to pull out. But those open-ended questions are the real meat, the real interesting stuff of this survey. We then asked people, after asking these open-ended questions, so we didn't want to bias those responses, we then asked people, okay, solutions to many issues can be found either through behavioral change at the individual level, changes to laws at the governmental level, or a mixture of both. What type of changes do you typically think about for the issue you're being asked about? And this is really interesting. Look at that. For climate change, yeah, the number of governmental solutions at 30%, so tied for lowest among all of these, but it isn't like these climate people are totally self-aware. It isn't like they said, oh yeah, I only think of individual solutions. There are a lot of them who thought there's this mixture here. And I want to be totally honest with you. We don't know what's going on here. I don't think the polling data itself speaks to this. Maybe what's going on here is that people are just ignorant of their own solutions and their own ways of thinking about these issues. Or maybe something else is going on here. Maybe this is almost like projecting their hope. Maybe people want to think that we address climate change or that we should address climate change largely through a mixture of individual change and political change. It's just that they can't come up with any political solutions because maybe they haven't been offered to them. I don't know. I don't even want to make it seem like I am implying that is the case. That is something that, if people are interested in, would require further research. But we do think that this is interesting, that there is this disconnect where, when asked open-ended questions about how to address the climate crisis, it's all individual behavioral solutions. When asked to categorize what types of solutions they tend to think about, they're wrong. They don't just think of those individual solutions. And then the last multiple choice question we just wanted to highlight is, who or what do you blame most for your issue? Individuals, corporations and financial interests, or state and federal policies? Now, we might be able to learn a lot more about this if we had asked an open-ended question, but boy, would it have been hard to create buckets for this. What's interesting here is, again, state and federal policies is the lowest for climate change. The climate movement, or not even the climate movement, when Americans are thinking about climate change, they do not think about politics. They just don't. That is screaming at us across this entire poll. But what is really interesting in this particular poll question is how much they lay the blame at corporations and financial interests. I think this is also something that hints at a lot of important new avenues of research. Boy, is it helpful to inspire people to societal change when they have a good idea of what the cause of the problem is. And at least at the moment, when Americans aren't blaming themselves for climate change, they are blaming corporations and financial interests. I'm not going to lead you into thinking one thing or another on that, other than, boy, is this an interesting finding. All right. So before we get to the Q&A, because we do want to leave plenty of time for a nice long Q&A session, I do want to highlight some of the things that we think were particularly important and actionable findings on this, and then a whole bunch of things that we think are now ripe for further research on this. So first, it is clear from this poll that lots of Americans care deeply about climate change, yet they view it as a problem requiring individual behavior change rather than political action. And I think all of us who care deeply about climate change, especially, and I know there are a lot of you here, those of us who run other environmental nonprofits and other political organizations, I think it's important that we start considering, is there a new type of persuasion target for the climate movement here? We spend a lot of time thinking of persuasion messaging as being geared towards persuading people to care more about climate change. And that's totally legit. But what if there's another target out there? Could it be easier to politicize folks who are already concerned about climate change than it is to go after those sort of more old-fashioned persuasion targets who need to have their minds changed about climate? I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but boy, do we need to start thinking hard about whether there are a whole bunch of Americans out there who don't need to be convinced to care more about climate. Instead, they need to be convinced to not view it as their own personal fault. They need to be convinced to not view it as something that they're going to fix through recycling or buying green products. Rather, they need to be politicized. Second finding, as I brought up, Americans are much more likely to blame corporations and financial interests for climate change than for any of the other issues tested. I'm not going to claim that this touches on an area of expertise that I have or that we have at the Environmental Voter Project. It doesn't. But it does touch on the areas of expertise of many of you here today. And I do think that you should take this data and work it. We've made all of our raw data publicly available. Not only do we have this polling report that lays out all of these charts for you, and we can share the link with you, please feel free to share it. But we also are making publicly available our raw top-line data and our raw crosstabs data. So that goes into breakdowns among various demographic groups. Use this, reach out to us, ask us questions. We want to be helpful to you. All right, some questions that are prompted by this research. Might this be a source of the climate movement's political weakness? As I think many of you know, our work at the Environmental Voter Project has consistently shown that people who care deeply about climate and the environment vote less often than the overall electorate. That's why we at EVP are so laser focused on finding these people who list climate as their number one priority, yet they aren't voting, and turning them into consistent voters. Might part of the cause of that lower turnout be what we were talking about today? Might it be that Americans just don't think of climate change in a political context? I don't know, but it's certainly looking really, really possible. Can we even identify this universe of people? So let me be clear about what I'm talking about here. If we're used to thinking of persuasion targets in the climate movement as people who are kind of climate curious, they care about climate change but don't realize how important it is, or things like that. Okay, well, we've gotten pretty good at being able to identify them, both by demographic group and also on the individual level in predictive models on voter files. This is a different universe. And I absolutely think it's worth looking into whether the climate movement more broadly can accurately identify people who already care about climate change but don't think of it as something that requires political solutions. Something that I think we really need to be seriously thinking about. Moreover, does this different persuasion group need unique messaging? So this is what I mean by this. If we think about these two broad categories of persuasion targets, so group A is how we typically think of climate messaging persuasion. People who need to be persuaded to either start caring about climate change or care more about it or vote based on it, or vote for candidate X based on it. This different group, B group, is people who are already concerned about climate change but need to be convinced of its political salience, of why it should be an important thing for politicians to focus on. If, in the previous slide, as I mentioned, if we can identify those people, we need to also be open to the idea that they might need a different type of messaging. The messaging that gets Group A to care more about climate might be very different from the messaging that gets Group B to become politicized. And boy, is this going to take a lot of testing. But it's an enormous source of political power at a moment in time when political power is everything. As we alluded to earlier, what should we make of the high levels of blame assigned to corporate and financial interests? Should the climate movement consider new messaging strategies to take advantage of this pre-existing blame? Can any of those messaging strategies lead to impactful actions? I don't know. Might it just be easier to leverage change on financial institutions or corporate entities because of this? I don't know. This data in the poll doesn't suggest an answer to that, but it certainly suggests that this is something that should be further researched. And more broadly, why? Why is this happening? Why are Americans assigning so much more blame to climate and financial interests in the climate sector than in some other places? Now, it might just be two very obvious sort of factual causes, financing of fossil fuel infrastructure and things like that. But another possibility, and this is something that one of you emailed me about a few days ago, is that maybe we're assigning blame to non-personal forces because we can't think of any non-personal solutions yet. Maybe people are crying out for answers to address the climate crisis that don't involve making ourselves feel like crap. Again, I don't want to suggest that that answer is in this poll. It's not. But boy, is this something that's important to research. And finally, I'll just say, please think about this unique approach that we took in this particular poll. Yes, it is more expensive. And boy, do I understand how everybody is strapped for resources these days. But it wouldn't surprise me if there are other ways that we in the climate movement are misinterpreting people's concern about climate change because we mistakenly assume a particular context. And just think about this. What biases do we already infect our data with when we ask people questions about the products that they buy to help the environment? Or what biases do we infect our data with when we ask people polling questions like, when voting for president, how important is climate change and things like that? When we force people to think about a set of issues within only one context. Yes, it's important to understand the political salience or the consumer salience of that issue, but what we might be missing is that those people care deeply about climate change. They just don't think of it in that context. I know this is outside of the wheelhouse of many of you, but for some of you, it's right in your wheelhouse. For some of you, you are very well equipped to try to start finding these people. And our polling suggests that there are millions of them out there who are deeply concerned about climate change, think about it all the time, yet aren't taking that with them when they go to the ballot box, aren't taking that with them on a daily basis when their friends and neighbors might be protesting in the streets. And if we can try to find these people and message to them in smart ways, we can add them to the enormous armies of people who we know need to get politicized to address the climate crisis. Because it is just an objective truth that the climate crisis is a systemic global problem that will require systemic political solutions. And if the number one response that people give off the top of their heads to addressing climate change is reduce, reuse, recycle, we're in trouble. I don't want to depress you. I actually think this is an enormous opportunity because we're finding all of this latent political power out there. All right, so I want to get to our Q&A. What now for the Environmental Voter Project before we get there? Well, as we alluded to at the very beginning, we are mobilizing close to 7 million climate first non-voters across 21 states this year. We are holding briefings and trainings and advising sessions for other organizations on this research that I just presented to you. So if you are interested in learning more about this research, reach out to us. Reach out to us at info@environmentalvoter.org. We're going to put it in the chat. We would be happy to give you all of our data and all of our insights, whatever they might be worth, on this information. It's important to us to be good allies and help people who can do really important things with this research. However, I want to reiterate to all of you, we're not a research organization. We need to do a lot of cutting edge research to support this really avant-garde voter mobilization work that we do, but we are going to remain laser focused on mobilizing voters. That's what we do at EVP. So I'm so glad that you came to learn about this research. We're going to get to the Q&A in a second, but if you're interested in joining our voter turnout work, you can help in 3 ways. 1, you can donate to support our work. All donations help. We're going to put a link in the chat. Big donations help even more. There is no limit on the amount you can donate. This is not a political campaign. And boy, with our randomized control trials and all of our other research, can we assure you that we are very careful about the messaging, about our targeting, and being efficient with your money. 2, you can volunteer to deliver these messages by canvassing and calling these targeted voters across the country this fall. We're going to be active in so many important elections in Virginia, New Jersey, Georgia, New York City, New Orleans, Atlanta, Albuquerque, all over the country. And then 3, in a little less than a month, we have our annual online fundraiser. It's over Zoom. We pack it with so much interesting data. I swear to God, people always really, really enjoy it. Please come. You don't have to donate to attend. Attend and let us convince you to donate. So please, you'll find that link in the chat as well, RSVP to get the Zoom credentials. And with that, let's get to your questions. What do we got, Peter?
Awesome. Thank you, Nathaniel. So there were a number of questions here. I'm going to make sure I get to as many as possible. Um, a large number of participants expressed a fair amount of consternation and, dare I say, anger over this kind of reality that so many environmentalists view individual action as much more important or relevant than especially governmental action. So, Brian, for instance, said it's pretty clear that the fossil fuel companies' efforts to deflect to our personal carbon footprint have sunk in for so many. How do we get voters to see past that? And I'm going to say one more. I'm going to ask as a continuation what here at EVP, because other folks have asked this as well, what does EVP want to do to try to change this dynamic given our kind of narrow niche here in the messaging movement?
Yeah, great, great question. So I'll answer those questions in order. So first of all, Brian, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's no room for opinion here. It is an absolute fact that the fossil fuel industry has had a very sophisticated and expensive PR campaign for probably 3 decades, convincing us that the climate crisis is a suicide rather than a homicide. And we bought it. And we all blame ourselves. And there's no doubt in my mind that that's why you're seeing this data. And there's no doubt in my mind that that's why you're all frustrated. And oh my God, do I share your frustration. Yeah, this makes me angry as hell. However, it would be even worse if we got all this polling data back and we were like, yeah, no one cares about climate change at all. That would suck, right? Like that's a much harder problem to solve. And yeah, this is frustrating. I don't deny it, but it is an opportunity. These are people who don't need to be persuaded to care deeply about climate change. They're already there. They need to be politicized. Now, to get to the second part of the question, I think we now need to think of potential targets for the climate movement in three buckets. One, persuasion targets, more sort of typical persuasion targets, people who need to be convinced to care more about climate change. That's not the work that EVP does. Two, people who list climate change as their number one political priority. So they already think it's their number one political priority, yet they aren't voting. That's what EVP focuses on. So we don't need to politicize those people, at least not in the typical sense of that word. They already know that this is the number one political issue for them, but they still suck at voting. The way to address that problem is through what EVP does. We canvass, we call, we mail, we send postcards, we do digital ads, all with behavioral science informed messaging that our randomized control trials prove increases turnout. If you go to our results page, I'd appreciate it if someone could put that link in the chat. You will find all of these randomized control trials proving that we know what messaging to deliver to these people to get them to vote. And the weird thing is, Brian and others, usually it's messaging that has nothing to do with climate or the environment. Usually it has to do with using forms of peer pressure and things like that to get them to vote. All right, now there's this third bucket. Now there's this other group of people that the climate movement may have to think about messaging to, who care deeply about climate change, don't think of it as their top political issue. And so maybe they're voting, maybe they're not voting, but they certainly don't view it as a politically salient issue yet. And I want to be honest with you. This is not something that the Environmental Voter Project is going to focus on. This is something that huge PR campaigns and big public advocacy groups are much better at doing. We have already identified at EVP almost 12 million of these non-voting environmentalists who do list climate as their number one political priority. That's a great opportunity, and we're really good at turning them into voters. This other group, I can tell you what I think the climate movement needs to do, but I don't want to mislead you into thinking that EVP is going to completely change our mission and add on a whole nother thing that we do. This is not our area of expertise, but we're pretty smart when it comes to researching how voters think, and we wanted to share these findings and continue sharing these findings with people. Right off the top of my head, some things that I think are really important is we are a storytelling species. It's what makes us unique among all the other species on Earth, is that we tell stories, and those stories allow us to collaborate and cooperate and do enormous things. Win world wars, go to the moon, things like that, solve global pandemics. Right now, the story archetype of the climate crisis, and I'm not going to go into the like 7 or 8 broad story archetypes, but it's a story we're all used to. It's a story of hubris. It's like the story of Icarus. It's the story of a species that just did too much and killed themselves because they were selfish or stupid or had so much hubris. That's a story we know. It's almost hardwired into our brains. And the climate crisis story that we tell ourselves really fits in that archetype. And boy, does that help us think of individual solutions to what is clearly not an individual problem. For my money, we need to shift to a different archetype. We need to shift to the type of story that is a hero overcoming a villain or a monster. This is more commonly known as the protagonist antagonist, where there is a value. There is good, there is bad, there is a value. We as a group come together, defeat the villain, defeat the antagonist, and achieve the promised land or achieve the goal. That is also a story that we are used to. That is an archetype that we know deep down in our veins. That is how we need to start thinking about politicizing people who care deeply about climate change. We need to get them out of thinking about this as a suicide and into thinking of this as a homicide. But again, I don't want to mislead any of you into thinking that this is EVP changing our focus. This isn't. What this is EVP, a cutting edge, enormously successful, and I'll be honest, really friggin' good voter turnout organization, stumbling upon some really useful data that we want to shout to the rooftops so that everybody else who is good at persuasion messaging can take advantage of it. And that's why we really do encourage many of you to reach out to us after this if you want to talk about this and ideas for further research. Okay, more questions.
I suspect that when Brian asked that question, he was hoping you'd bring up Icarus. Um, a few folks have similarly asked, and you really got into this toward the end, Nathaniel, before the Q&A here. So pardon me if this is a little repetitive to what you've already said, but what comes next in this process for us? So you had some really good suggestions here, but by us, I mean the organization and the Environmental Voter Project, but also the broader climate movement. I mean, is it more polling and surveys, quantitative research, or is it do we need to start moving into kind of real world applications here?
Great question. I think it's always important to do more research. I know people hate that. And believe me, I'm an action-oriented person. We literally are involved in close to 500 elections this year. But I think it, no one is the average likely voter. No one is. I don't care how smart you are. You are not the average likely voter or the average non-voter. It's always helpful to understand more about people. But as far as acting, this is where I think we are in the climate movement right now. It's a big question that requires a big answer, but I'll try to keep it short. We all know how awful the last 8, 9 months have been. They've been devastating. They've been devastating. And I think rightly so, many Americans and many people in the climate movement are still searching for answers. Answers to some of these persuasion problems that I've put up, answers to political problems. What do we do in this campaign? Who do we elect? What do we do? I'm not going to claim that I have all the answers to those questions. I don't. What I do know is this, though. We at the Environmental Voter Project have an answer to a problem that happens to be a really big and important problem, which is that depending on the election, anywhere from 8 to 12, maybe even 13 million already registered voters who already list climate and the environment as their number one political priority aren't showing up to vote. And we've got hundreds of randomized control trials proving that we know how to get them to vote. And so again, I won't claim that this is some magic silver bullet. I won't claim that this is the answer to all that ails the climate movement and the broader progressive movement right now, because it sure as hell isn't. But at a time when we're all searching for answers, EVP has something really special to offer. One, proven results to a really important problem. When what we need more than anything is more political power, we know how to get it. And moreover, Not only do we have that proven answer to that important problem, but we're doing it right now. You don't need to wait for 2016. We have already been active in 415 elections this year. And if we think ahead to just the next 10 weeks, we are going to be mobilizing hundreds of thousands of these climate first, unlikely voters in the Virginia gubernatorial, the New Jersey gubernatorial, the two Public Service Commission elections in Georgia. Public service commissioners regulate utilities. These are crucially important. The New York City mayoral, the New Orleans mayoral, the Atlanta mayoral, the Albuquerque mayoral, county commissioner races in Pennsylvania, statewide elections in Maine, in Texas. Maricopa County has elections. Mecklenburg County has a transit ballot measure. Yes, we are such nerds that we know all of this stuff inside our heads. This is what you can do. This is what you can do. So go to environmentalvoter.org/get-involved. We're going to put the link in the chat. You can sign up to volunteer. Almost every day from here through November 4th, we are going to have volunteer activities for you. Let's take phone banking as an example. When you show up for a phone bank on Zoom, you don't start doing anything until you are fully trained and you feel fully comfortable and ready to go. Number two, I promise you we're going to give you a script that has been proven in a randomized control trial to actually increase turnout of these climate first voters. The second thing that you can do is donate to support our work. And I'm not going to say that with an ounce of embarrassment. The climate crisis and our democracy crisis are way too important for me to be ashamed to ask you to invest in stuff that I know works. So please support our work by making a donation through that link. RSVP to our September 17th annual fundraiser. Bring your friends. Again, it's not required to make a donation to show up, listen to what we've got to say, and I really think you'll like what you hear. And then the final thing is, please do reach out to us. If you want to learn more about this particular research, even though it's not fully aligned with what we do as a voter mobilization organization, boy, do we want to be helpful. We know at EVP that even though we've got some great answers to some important problems, we don't have all the answers to all the problems, but boy, do we want to be helpful to you. We know that there are leaders of great environmental organizations on this call, and we want to be good allies. We want to help you. And so reach out to us, info@environmentalvoter.org. Finally, we also want to respect your time. We told you this would last an hour. I know we only got to a handful of questions. Please feel free to also email those questions to us at info@environmentalvoter.org. So with that, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Shannon. And thank you, all of you. My gosh, this is an enormous crowd. We are so, so grateful that you spent your evening with us. Have a nice night.